Welcome to the Somatic Coaching Academy podcast with Ani and Brian. Join us as we explore the art and science of trauma-sensitive somatic practices and tools to strengthen your practice as a coach, therapist, or holistic professional. Master the art of motivating even the most challenging clients when you'll understand how to tap into and unlock your client's complete holistic intelligence. If you want to learn the most cutting-edge, research-supported skills for personal and professional mastery, you've come to the right place. Let's get this conversation started.
Hi, and welcome to the Somatic Coaching Academy podcast. This week, art and science are sitting in for Brian and Ani. Hi there, science.
Hello, Art.
How are you feeling today?
Well, the ambient temperature is 72 degrees, which is optimal for my biometric functioning.
Oh my gosh, you're unbelievable. And you couldn't even iron your lab coat before I got to tell you, sitting here next to you wearing white when I'm wearing cream, it's really challenging for me.
I believe the colors, while not completely complementary, are actually close enough in proximity to one another to be rather pleasing to the eye.
But they're not. And if you're listening to this podcast episode, I highly encourage you to go to our YouTube channel, look up Somatic Coaching Academy, and you will get to see Science's hair and get up. How was it doing your hair this morning? You're not used to that.
I don't do anything with my hair.
Really?
I'm science.
I hadn't noticed.
I sleep 3 hours a night.
Oh, God.
I spend most of the day in the lab.
I love that. I don't know how you do that.
Away from other humans.
Well, I'm so excited to be sitting next to you, human to human, for this episode of the Somatic Coaching Academy podcast. Hey, Science, why don't you tell everybody what we're talking about today?
Today's topic, which is episode number 16, is the art and science of setting healthy boundaries.
I am really excited about this topic. I've got to tell you, I've been feeling into this probably for a few years. You know, boundaries is something that people talk about all the time. I see posts on Instagram, some of them beautiful, by the way. And, you know, I think it's can be challenging to wrap our heads around and to really feel into in the society that we're living in. So I'm really looking forward to this conversation. And hey, since you're science, why don't you go ahead and lead us into it?
I find this topic also intellectually stimulating. Art, thank you so much for inviting me to have a discussion about this today.
You're welcome.
When I think about setting healthy boundaries, I think about how a cell would set healthy boundaries.
A cell?
A cell, a single-celled organism. Effectively, we are each 70 trillion single-celled organisms living in a community together. And to live in a community in a healthy way that helps everyone thrive, it's important to have healthy boundaries. So how would a single cell set a boundary?
Well, can we just stop for a second? Like, what is healthy? What does it mean to set a healthy boundary? Science. What does that feel like?
I have no idea what it feels like.
Well, I'll tell you what it feels like to me. So when I think about setting a healthy boundary and I really feel into it, I want it to feel enlivening in my body. I don't want it to feel like I'm armoring up or I'm building a wall. I want it to feel like things can come in and they can go out. And it's not like anything's sticky in me and I don't get hung up on things. I also don't want to be like rude about it. I want it to feel like flow and seamless. I want it to feel easy. That's what I want a healthy boundary to feel like.
Well, scientifically speaking, a healthy boundary would be a boundary in which the cell or organism thrives when it takes in the environment of the health, if you will. So a cell is going to make a decision to either and we can talk all about this. This is very intellectually exciting and
sure you
stimulating for
love
me.
that.
And studying this for years in
Just
my
waiting for this
just
moment.
waiting for this moment. I've been
Waiting
in
for
my
this microphone
laboratory
moment.
looking at amoebas for years to have this conversation. But for me, the idea of we know a health boundary is healthy when an organism thrives. Its physiology becomes balanced. It's able to grow and nurture its young and offspring in ways that perpetuate the species for longer periods of time without toxicity. That's how we can determine health. And there's both qualitative and quantitative ways to measure this, right? We can measure rates of happiness, subjectively reported, of course, by the subjects that are reporting these sorts of things. And there are multiple levels of questionnaires that have been validated to determine what people's levels of happiness are, their levels of quality of life, contentment, those sorts of things. And all of these things we know are correlated with individuals or cells, multiplication of cells, a community of cells such as we are, that are able to decide to set healthy boundaries.
I got stuck with offspring because I'm not sure how our children are going to feel about being called offspring. But let's go back to what you were talking about healthy boundaries. I literally got kind of caught up on offspring and subjects. What were you saying?
If we go back to the way a cell sets a boundary, for a long period of time, since Darwin, actually, right, we've fallen under this assumption that our DNA at the center of a cell, right? So you have a cell, and at the center of the cell, you have a nucleus at the center of the cell. And so when a cell divides, the DNA in that nucleus will split and replicate to create an offspring cell. That's just how it works.
Of course.
And so for a long period of time, we thought that DNA was the end all and the be all of the cell, that the DNA was the brain of the cell. But
Eureka!
We have since discovered that that is not true. A cell can be enucleated, which means that the nucleus can be destroyed, and the cell can still live for weeks or months without its nucleus.
Really?
However, what you maybe did not know is that a cell will die immediately if its membrane is removed.
That's so it's boundary.
Exactly. So it turns out that, and this is Bruce Lipton talks about this in his award-winning book, The Biology of Belief, which is filled with stem cell science, which is just
loved
brilliant.
reading that book. It was incredibly inspiring.
Incredibly thought-provoking, I believe, and filled with validated information, which was so compelling. And one of the things that was pointed out in that book is that what Bruce Lipton talks about is that the membrane is actually the brain.
The membrane.
Membrane of the cell.
Membrane.
And the DNA is actually the gonads.
Really? The membrane's the brain.
And the DNA is simply the reproductive organs of the cell.
So
the membrane is the most important part of the cell. And that's because the membrane has what we call semi-permeability. There's channels in the membrane where the membrane can allow certain materials to come into the cell and out of the cell.
this is what I'm talking about in terms of boundaries. I don't want to feel when I'm thinking about boundaries or I'm setting boundaries like I'm a wall, science. I want to feel in the flow of the experience. I want it to feel easy. And I got to tell you, I want to still have compassion for the other human being when I'm thinking and feeling into these boundaries. And so what you're saying makes a lot of sense. I can really feel into it. It feels very aligned. But the thing that I'm not quite embodied around yet is this idea of the membrane being the brain. How can that be that the boundary has intelligence?
Well, if we can, for a moment, jump to a multi-celled organism, such as humans, mammals, other creatures that fly, crawl, walk, sort of thing. In humans and mammals, especially in this regard, the brain and the skin have an intimate embryological connection. When an embryo is forming in uterus, it differentiates, which means specializes, into 3 different layers of cells: endoderm, ectoderm, and mesoderm. Now, the ectoderm layer is the nervous system, the brain, the spinal cord, the nerves, but also the skin. So we may think about it that the skin is either the outermost surface of the brain or the brain is the innermost surface of the skin.
Ooh, fascinating.
So the membrane in a single cell, when it becomes multiplied 70 trillion times over time and we become more of a highly specialized organism like humans are versus amoebas, we retain the trait of the intelligence being in the membrane or the boundary setting area.
I really like this because as I'm thinking about boundaries and I'm thinking about my skin being a boundary, and I think about and I feel into what it feels like to be on the inside of me and then to feel into what's external to me. I think about all my senses and how enlivened they can be in the world and the universe and all of my relationships, whether it's a relationship with a person or a relationship with a thing or, things like this cup. I love this cup. It's so beautiful. It makes me feel so good inside. And that's how I want to feel in my relationships as well. That's how I want to feel in my boundaries. And I want my membrane to not feel hardened or like a cat with its hair like sticking like I don't want to feel like that with boundaries.
It appears to me that there is a large degree of electrochemical information occurring in your physiology at the moment, Art.
How can you tell?
I'm intuitive that way. So everything you've said reflects back in a way that is completely foreign to me, but I am understanding it intellectually, and I very much appreciate that. I believe there's good evidence to support, actually, as well, in research, that individuals that are capable of and tend to set healthier or less blurred boundaries in their work and life relationships actually have higher levels of rating of happiness and sleep and physical exertion levels, which is very, very important. But if we go back to the single cell for a second, may I make another note about the single cell?
Sure.
Okay. The DNA is actually very, very important. And the DNA does determine the physiological function in our bodies. So we're not throwing the DNA totally out. It's super important, very important.
Not throwing the
Don't
gonads out.
Don't want to throw the gonads out. We want to keep the gonads. And the DNA is going to express certain physiological properties. And those physiological properties can express properties that create inflammation, say, or they could express properties that create balance and health in the tissues. And our DNA is not predetermined in its function. But then we might ask ourselves, what influences our DNA expression? Because they're
feelings.
That's very insightful, Art.
Thank you.
There's much, much truth to that. You're absolutely right. Because even one single gene blueprint in your DNA can express over 2,000 different variations in expression.
I have many different variations of my expression too.
You are just like your DNA.
Amazing.
Exactly. So when we ask ourselves what controls the expression of the DNA, because the DNA is simply a blueprint. Someone must read the blueprint. Someone must enact the blueprint, such as if a builder was constructing a home, they would use a blueprint to do that. So what determines that? The membrane. On the outside of the cell membrane, there are receptor sites that connect with environmental neurohormones, aka feelings, molecules of emotion. Candace Pert led us into that information, but also environmental vibrational stimuli. There are receptors on the outsides of the cell that receive vibrational stimuli from your environment as well. And when those receptor sites are activated on the cell membrane, information is sent through the gated channels in the membrane to a second messenger that carries information into the DNA and basically enables a specific expression or blueprint. So what we know in stem cell research, that if a cell is not healthy, the first place to look is in the environment.
Okay, so you just said a lot of words. And I've got to tell you, when you're talking about the research, I am thinking of other things. However, that was interesting. I'm thinking as I'm listening to you, how does this apply to me? How does this apply to what is actually going on? So what did you say about the external environment right there?
I said that the external environment is the most important predictor, actually, causation of how healthy a cell will be. A healthy cell cannot thrive in a toxic environment.
Just like I cannot thrive in a toxic relationship.
Exactly.
I knew it.
So each cell, even a single-celled amoeba, has a pre-programmed program, if you will.
A pre-programmed program.
Pre-programmed program.
Is that the scientific way to say that?
That's it. Evolutionarily determined that a single cell will move towards something in its environment that nourishes it, that fosters growth. And as it moves towards that thing, the gates on the membrane open up to receive the information through the membrane because the membrane is semi-permeable. Now, contrast to that, if there is something toxic in the environment, an amoeba will move away from it and close the gates.
Hang on a second, science, because I have seen plenty of people, I can think about a bunch, and myself at times, who have moved closer to toxic environments or who don't leave. What's that about?
That is because we are not as smart as a single cell.
Okay, that's unfortunate.
Because if you were a single cell, in order to determine the healthiest aspect of yourself, we would choose environments and create environments that would foster more health and growth.
What you're saying is that we're more complex. Is that what you're saying? That we're more complex than a single cell?
We are much more complex. On that, we can be in agreement, Art.
That feels so good. That art and science on the same page about this. Can we get practical here, science, for a minute? Like, what does this mean to help people to set healthy boundaries? I mean, what I heard you say is don't be in toxic environments.
Well, what the science would say is that we can choose whatever we would like to choose. However, when we choose to be in a toxic environment, our physiology will become toxic. And we are less likely then to thrive and grow.
That happens, right? Like when I'm in a toxic environment or I see my friends in a toxic environment, you can tell their insides just don't feel good. They just don't feel good. So can we talk about how to set some healthy boundaries? Because we understand that when we're in a toxic environment, we don't want to be there. And a lot of people struggle with this, science, because they want to set better boundaries. They don't know how.
It's very important, Art, to set healthy boundaries at work, to set healthy boundaries with family, to set healthy boundaries with your children, to set healthy boundaries wherever.
Yeah, but sometimes I can't. Why can't I set healthy boundaries sometimes?
For this, we need to move more into the psychotherapeutic realms of humans, or psychological realms of humans, I might say. As we move up and become more complex and complicated from a single-celled organism,
Pretty complicated.
and we move into humans, there are determinants that are driven through our subconscious mind. In the way that we are programmed as humans early in our lives, it may appear to us that an environment is safer than another environment. However, just because it's safer doesn't mean it's not toxic.
Sure, I get that.
So sometimes the best that humans can do is move from a more toxic environment to a less toxic environment. Now, over time, we would hope that a human could make choices to move themselves into environments that are healthy and nourishing much of the time.
Well, I think also what you were saying is that my skin is the membrane and there's things that are going on inside of me and there's the environment that's outside of me, but I have control over the things that are happening inside of me. And perhaps I can work on developing safety inside of myself.
That is absolutely true, Art. And we might also say a single cell only has it can really only move towards and away. And it can only move so far towards or away an environment. It's really limited in a lot of those ways. Where humans, we are less limited. We have more various and varied
possibilities
possibilities of response too. So I think the first thing we would want to think about is, number one, are the relationships that we are in at this moment, work relationships, family relationships, neighbor relationships, friend relationships, how nourishing is the evidence? What's the evidence of how nourishing they are that we have? How, when we're in these relationships, how well are we sleeping? When we're in these relationships,
How do we feel?
how much energy do we have? When we're in these relationships, how is our digestive functioning? When we're in these relationships,
How creative are we?
how are our thought processes? How clearly? How safe do we feel? Certainly is an important one also, probably one of the primal ones. So if we think about each one of those relationships, we could do a simple grading process and say to ourselves, in this relationship, on a scale of 0 to 10, say, like, how thriving does it feel versus how non-thriving does it feel?
And when you're looking at how it feels, you can tap into where in your body you feel that and what does it feel like?
I think there's an important, if we follow the wisdom of a single cell, the single cell isn't going to debate, the single cell isn't going to stay in an environment that's toxic. It's going to try to move away from it. If it can't get out of that toxic environment, it's going to do the best it can within that environment and eventually perish. So as humans, if we feel like we are in a relationship that doesn't feel like it helps us thrive, then the question might be, why am I in this relationship? Or what about this relationship doesn't help me feel like it thrives? And then we have choice whether or not we'd like to change that to a different relationship. But the things with humans that we want to remember is that because we're humans and we're not single cells, we fall into the illusion that we can thrive in unhealthy environments.
Our perception kind of, hoodwinks us into thinking that.
Exactly. Where the fact is that no matter how healthy we are, if you spend long enough time in a toxic environment, you will become unhealthy.
Yeah. And we feel that it feels like it and we know it and we know it and we can override that knowing.
So the way that a cell would set the healthy boundary, it's very scientific. It's either this environment helps me thrive or it does not.
It's binary. It's one or the other.
And if it helps me thrive, then I will seek more of it. And if it does not, I will find one that does.
So let's talk about this because we know our perception can cause us to stay in places that don't feel good, even if we've made the decision that this is not a healthy environment for me. So how do we set boundaries without being rude?
What do you think, Art?
Well, I'll tell you, the place that I want to come from.
Because sometimes I feel like I'm rude.
Like that?
Sometimes I don't feel like I'm paying attention enough to the physical.
You're touching my membrane
shoulder
right now.
of your membrane. That's an interesting stimulus that I'm feeling in my whole beingness.
Well, go ahead and tell me what you think, science, since you just so rudely interrupted me, because I didn't hear what you just said. I was feeling a little offended.
I apologize, Art, for interrupting so callously and coarsely. Where were we?
How can I set a boundary without being rude?
What do you think, Art?
Oh my gosh, we just did this. I was telling you, but you interrupted me. Don't interrupt me again, please. Wait, was that a boundary? Oh, let me do it better. Can I rewind? I want to do it again. Here's what I want to do. I want to say, science, I really want to hear what you have to think about this, but could I please get my full sentence out first? Because when I communicate, I want to be able to say my whole thought and be able to get it off of my head and out of my body. And then I want to be fully present for you. Does that sound good?
That sounds like a very well-organized way to have an exchange.
Well, it just felt good and clear and compassionate to me because when you interrupted me, I couldn't even hear what you were saying next. And I do want to be present. That is the kind of person, science, that I want to be in my life. I want to be present for you, but not at the expense of being present for me. And so one of the things I did right there is I set clear expectations, but I also created a standard for how I'm going to be in the world. And I had, for me, I don't know about you, science, but that standard about how I'm going to be in the world has something not just to do with how I am and how I'm feeling, but also how I want our relationship to be. And so when I set my standard, I think about the relationship that I want to have with you and how I want to be with you too. For me, that kind of talks about this semi-permeable aspect of a boundary and not just saying, don't interrupt me or I'm not going to talk to you anymore.
Art,
What do you think about that?
if you had to rate your subjective level of happiness and confidence right now on a scale of 0 to 10, what would you say it is?
I'd give myself an 11.
I think that's a wonderful, obviously helpful and successful way to set a boundary.
Thank you. I appreciate that. This was a really fun conversation. Sometimes I thought you were boring, science, but for the most part, I thought you were pretty cool.
Thank you, Art. I appreciate your patience with me.
No problem. And join us next time on Art and Science. But for the next episode of the Somatic Coaching Academy podcast, if I remember correctly, I think Brian and Ani are back.
I will be in my laboratory.
Okay, you'll be in your laboratory. I will be in my studio. And you will see Brian and Ani on the next episode of the Somatic Coaching Academy podcast. Bye for now.
Good day.
Thank you for listening to this episode. We hope that this conversation will help you improve your practice and change the way you think about your work, your clients, and yourself. Continue your exploration of trauma-sensitive somatic coaching by listening to more podcast episodes at somaticcoachingacademy.com. You could be the trusted guide that people turn to help them with their most challenging situations and to reach their most precious goals. Thank you for joining us. We'll see you next time.